I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're starting with a new book, 11.1, The Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers, by George M. Young. 1. The Spiritual Geography of Russian Cosmism. There is that in the Russian soul which corresponds to the immensity, the vagueness, the infinitude of the Russian land. Spiritual geography corresponds with physical. Two contradictory principles lay at the foundation of the structure of the Russian soul. The one a natural, Dionysian, elemental paganism, and the other ascetic monastic orthodoxy. The mutually contradictory properties of the Russian people may be set out thus: despotism, the hypertrophy of the state, and on the other hand, anarchism and license; cruelty, a disposition to violence, and again, kindliness, humanity, and gentleness; a belief in rites and ceremonies, but also a quest for truth; individualism, a heightened consciousness of personality, together with an impersonal collectivism; nationalism, laudation of self and universalism, the ideal of the universal man; an eschatological messianic spirit of religion, and a devotion which finds its expression in externals, a search for God, and a militant godlessness; humility and arrogance, slavery and revolt. But never has Russia been bourgeois. That was a quote by Nikolai Fedderov in The Russian Idea. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian intellectuals have directed much of what Fedorov describes as their traditional prodigious, contradictory, but creative mental energy towards bringing back into focus and finding new signs of vitality in writers, artists, thinkers, and intellectual currents suppressed, degraded, or merely ignored during the Soviet period. One of the most vigorous and productive of these rediscovered intellectual tendencies is Russian Cosmism, a highly controversial and oxymoronic blend of activist speculation, futuristic traditionalism, religious science, esotericism, utopian pragmatism, idealistic materialism, higher magic partnered to higher mathematics. General characteristics. Main themes in cosmist thought include the active human role in human and cosmic evolution, the creation of new life forms, including a new level of humanity, the unlimited extension of human longevity to a state of practical immortality, the physical resurrection of the dead. Serious scientific research into matters long considered subjects fit only for science fiction, occult, and esoteric literature. The exploration and colonization of the entire cosmos. The emergence on our biosphere of a new sphere of human thought called the New Sphere, and other far-reaching quote-unquote projects, some of which may no longer seem as impossible or crazy as they did when first proposed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sufficiently contradictory and compelling to serve as a living example of Fedorov's definition of the Russian soul. Cosmism has today entered the curriculum of Russian schools and universities, is discussed and debated in large crowded halls at frequent academic conferences around the country, and is the subject of a multiplying number of academic articles, dissertations, and scholarly books, presented in both print and electronic media. Once dismissed and derided, cosmist ideas are now regarded as a main tendency in Russian culture and thought. Several factors contribute to the high degree of interest in cosmism among today's Russian intellectuals. First, the cosmists, like many Russians, are expansive thinkers. Their worldview attempts to comprehend all humanity, all time, all space, all science, art, and religion. Moreover, this view is totalitarian in the sense that it must apply to all without exception. As Berdyaev has suggested, half solutions do not satisfy the Russian soul. And as we shall see, the Cosmists do not favor half solutions. Second, the Cosmists emphasize their Russianness. The adjective they frequently use in referring to both early and recent Cosmist thought is otechestnivny, native, patriotic, without the Latinate flavor it carries in English, fatherlandish, without Teutonic connotations. Otechestnivny is the word used in referring to World War II as the Great Patriotic War, and when applied to Cosmist thought, can suggest that even the most unorthodox speculations are grounded in the rich, damp Russian soil. The Cosmist thinkers would probably be placed outside or on the periphery of the modern Western philosophical tradition, with its rationalist or empiricist principles, its narrowing into specialized interests, and its emphasis on epistemology, whereas in the Russian God-seeking but human-centered philosophical tradition, emphasizing the existential, the historiographic, and the eschatological, the Cosmists are well within the mainstream. Third, and connected to the previous point, the Cosmists are at least slightly, some of them even more than slightly, anti-Western. And in Russia, today as yesterday, this resonates. To the Cosmists, the intellectual culture of the West is isolative, individualistic, arrogant, divisive, uncentered, and self-destructive. Cosmism is presented as a robust, native alternative to the fashionable but shallow and overrated Western intellectual currents of deconstruction, ecosophism, species egalitarianism, and other alien abominations. To its adherents, Cosmism is a continental Eurasian antidote to the growing threat of cultural and intellectual Atlanticism. Fourth, the Cosmists were banned during the Soviet period. Their works could not be published, and the thinkers themselves were either forced into emigration or sent to the Gulag, where many were executed and others died from disease, starvation, or hard labor. After the fall of communism, the writings that had been most strenuously prohibited understandably became the most immediately appealing. Locked trunks and secret drawers began to open. Manuscripts hidden or ignored for 30, 40, even 100 years reemerged fresh and new. This rediscovery of such a rich, hidden past has become a major part of the Russian vision of the distant future, so that thinkers who appeared out of step with their own time are now considered all the more in step with ours and with times that will come after ours. Fifth, many of the Cosmists were polymaths, not only interested in but highly competent in 2, 3, or half a dozen specialized disciplines. As philosophers, artists, natural scientists, theologians, and social activists, individually and collectively, they tended to be encyclopedic in their erudition, jacks of all intellectual trades and masters of most. Each was so highly respected in at least one recognizable field that his cosmist speculations, even if unorthodox, borrowed at least the possibility of legitimacy. Sixth, like much Russian religious and spiritual writing, Cosmism has a profoundly mystical, occult, esoteric dimension. As George Vernadsky documents in The Origins of Russia, the practice of magic and exercise of shamanistic supernatural powers dominate the earliest records of Russian spiritual life, a tendency that continues to our day. A study of Russian publications in the 1990s found that some 39% of all nonfiction books published in Russia in that decade had something to do with the occult. And a trip through any large bookstore in Russia today would probably produce a similar, if not even larger, unofficial tally. The air of intellectual legitimacy that Cosmism lends to certain occult or semi-occult speculations, accounts for some of the appeal of the movement today. Cosmism provides a forum for serious, modern, academic, or intellectual consideration of topics normally associated with occult or pre-scientific investigation. As we shall see further along in this study, Cosmism does meet the 4 necessary and 2 optional criteria suggested in Antoine Feddorov's definition of esotericism. But if a narrower and more specific label is necessary, one I would propose, if it were not such a mouthful, would be exoteric thaumaturgy, wonder-working conducted in an open, intellectually respectable form. 7th, the Cosmists offer far-sighted and carefully considered answers to the most frequently asked question in Russian intellectual history. Sho dalat? What is to be done? The answer to this perennial Russian question is inevitably a plan, and the plan offered by the Cosmists is, if no more workable or realizable, at least bolder and more comprehensive than those offered by most other thinkers at most other times in Russian history. 8th, even in the face of formidable challenges, and in no way turning aside from the problems to be faced, the Cosmists offer a positive, hopeful outlook. Despite the odds, they remain optimistic and do not succumb to what they see as today's Western doom and gloom. They convey the traditional Russian sense that no matter how bad a situation may look at the moment, no matter how great a threat that any Batu Khan, Napoleon, Hitler, or other human or non-human forces may present, history has repeatedly shown that Russia, and under its leadership humanity, will eventually prevail. But if Cosmism is viewed by its prominent adherents as the most Russian and therefore most significant current of thought running from the 19th through the 21st century, outside Russia, the movement and the figures associated with it are all but unknown. The Western transhumanists, the cryonicists, the immortalists, and certain New Age spiritual movements share some Cosmist ideas and practices, and present the closest foreign analog. But by and large, futuristic Russian and Western thinkers remain separated by a curtain perhaps no longer made of iron but of language, culture, and other materials, invisible, intangible, but very durable. As mentioned above and elsewhere frequently noted, Russia has long been fertile ground for esotericism. Major individual figures in earlier Russian esotericism, such as the 18th century Rosicrucians Nikolai Novikov and Johann Schwartz, are still little known outside Russia. But in more recent times, since the late 19th century, some of the best-known figures in the history of Western esotericism have spent their early years, and some more than their early years, in Russia. H.P. Blavatsky, George Gurdjieff, P.D. Ouspensky, Nicholas and Helena Roerich, Rasputin, and more recently, Vissarion of the Last Testament and Anastasia of the Ringing Cedars are names that immediately come to mind. But at the same time that these names were becoming so familiar in and beyond esoteric circles worldwide, the all but unnoticed Cosmists were devoting serious philosophical, theological, and scientific attention to matters usually considered topics for esoteric speculation, such as self-directed evolution toward higher levels of humanity, human attainment of virtual omniscience, omnipotence, and immortality, the restoration of life to the dead, the influence of astral forces on human affairs, the human attainment of superhuman powers, the radical alteration and spiritualization of the material world. The major figures usually listed as Cosmists include many names little known in the West. The eccentric librarian and religious thinker Nikolai Fedderov, the mystical poet and idealist philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, the legendary physicist and lecturer Nikolai Fedorov, the rocket pioneer and theosophical writer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the geochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, the religious philosophers Sergei Bulgakov, Nikolai Berdyaev, and Pavel Florensky, the diplomat and Soviet government official Valerian Muravyov, the Fedorovian activists Alexander Gorsky and Nikolai Setnitsky, the Soviet scientists Alexander Chizhevsky, Nikolai Kolodny, Vasily Kuprovich, and Alexei Manev. Editor's note, please excuse me for these pronunciations if I'm butchering them. Individually, these thinkers have not considered themselves part of an intellectual school of any kind, especially an esoteric school. But regarded together, their contributions to separate fields of study exhibit many points in common with each other, as well as with the works of such earlier figures in the Western esoteric tradition as Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Cornelius Agrippa, Giordano Bruno, and Francis Bacon. As Francis Yates noted in the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, nowhere in the New Atlantis does Bacon mention the rose and cross, but the entire work is full of Rosicrucian ideas. So it is with the Russian Cosmists. Seldom do any of them acknowledge occult sources or inclinations, but their works are replete with theosophical and esoteric ideas, couched in the rhetoric of mainstream intellectual discourse. Indeed, their major contribution to the Western tradition of esotericism may in fact lie in their transformation of esoteric into exoteric investigations, the renewal of legitimate research into topics academically discredited or avoided since the 17th century dawn of the Age of Reason. Recent definitions of Cosmism. Early references to Russian Cosmism as a school of thought came in the first decades of the 20th century, but the first retrospective scholarly attempts to define who the Cosmists were and what distinguished the Cosmists from other schools of thought came in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when ideas, texts, and materials suppressed through the Soviet period began to reappear. Svetlana Smenova, today's leading proponent and authority on the movement, has found the defining genetic mark of Cosmist thought to be active evolution. In her introduction to a valuable anthology of Cosmist thought published in 1993, she wrote, "To avoid an unwieldy and limitless extension of this philosophical current is possible, if from the start we designate a principally new kind of relationship to the world, displaying a defining genetic mark. This is the idea of active evolution, i.e., the necessity for a new conscious stage of development of the world, when humanity directs it on a course which reason and moral feeling determine, when man takes, so to say, the wheel of evolution into his own hands. Man, for actively evolutionary thinkers, is a being in transition, in the process of growing, far from complete, but also consciously creative, called upon to overcome not only the outer world, but also his inner nature." Thus, in Semenova's definition, Cosmism not only shifts our perspective from an Earth-centered to a cosmos-centered view, not only shifts our self-image from Earth-dweller to cosmic citizen, but emphasizes that present humanity is not the end point of evolution, that in addition to its long past, the evolutionary process also has a long future, and that humanity is now in a position to direct and shape its own future evolution. In an article from a collection devoted to the broad topic of Russia and the occult, a leading Western scholar of Russian intellectual history, Michael Hagemeister, adds more quote-unquote genetic marks to the definition. Russian Cosmism and Russian Cosmist thinking are terms indicative of a broad intellectual movement in contemporary Russia, which has scarcely been noticed in the West. Stated briefly, Russian Cosmism is based on a holistic and anthropocentric view of the universe, which presupposes a teleologically determined and thus meaningful evolution. Its adherents strive to redefine the role of humankind in a universe that lacks a divine plan for salvation, thus acknowledging the threat of self-destruction. As rational beings who are evolving out of the living matter of the earth, human beings appear destined to become a decisive factor in cosmic evolution, a collective cosmic self-consciousness, active agent, and potential perfecter. Cosmic evolution is thus dependent on human action to reach its goal, which is perfection or wholeness. By failing to act or failing to act correctly, humankind dooms the world to catastrophe. According to Cosmism, the world is in a phase of transition from the biosphere, the sphere of living matter, to the noosphere, the sphere of reason. During this phase, the active unification and organization of the whole of humankind into a single organism is said to result in a higher planetarian consciousness, capable of guiding further development reasonably and ethically, changing and perfecting the universe, overcoming disease and death, and finally bringing forth an immortal human race. Active or self-directed evolution, then, holistic, anthropocentric, and teleologically determined effort, are some of the terms that scholars have applied to all the Russian cosmist thinkers, whether the given cosmist is a poet, an artist, a theologian, a philosopher, or a natural scientist. To these marks, I would add a few more general characteristics. One is the previously mentioned tendency, which will be a primary focus of the present study, to transform esoteric knowledge into exoteric, to turn elements of traditional occult wisdom into new directions in philosophy, theology, literature, art, and science, a tendency that has allowed some critics of Cosmism to dismiss it as pseudoscience, pseudotheology, and pseudophilosophy. But as we shall see a bit further along, the lines between intellectual categories are perhaps more often blurred in the Russian tradition than in the Western European tradition of speculation. A better way to describe Russian Cosmism than to call it pseudo-this or pseudo-that might be to regard it as occupying a unique borderland, a crossover area between science and magic, a back-and-forth process in which thaumaturgy finds academic legitimacy, and academic knowledge becomes thaumaturgical. As also mentioned above, and as many commentaries, including my own, have often observed, the Cosmists also characteristically display an emphasis on the Russianness of their project, a suggestion, sometimes even an insistence, that being Russian has something to do with the cosmic scope of their creative thought, that a Slavic instinct for expansiveness, wholeness, unity, and total solutions underlies the global and beyond global character of their investigations and projects. In several of the Cosmists, we see a neo-Slavophile, neo-Eurasian, or even a Russian nationalistic tendency that does not necessarily contradict or interfere with the international, interplanetary, intergalactic scope of their vision. Borrowing Peter Shadev's memorable phrase, with one elbow resting on Germany and the other on China, Russia, according to Cosmists following the Slavophile thinking, is in a position to offer a broader outlook, a healthy middle way between the extremes of East and West, and a fresh synthesis of the best features from many traditions. In the passage from The Russian Idea, quoted at the head of this chapter, Nikolai Berdyaev writes of the immensity, the vagueness, the infinitude of the Russian land, the spiritual geography which corresponds with the physical. And many others beside Berdyaev have noted the expansive and seemingly bipolar character of Russian literature and thought, the tendency most evident in a writer like Dostoevsky to push to the extremes psychological and spiritual characteristics which are present but less sharply pronounced in other traditions of literature and thought. To many of today's Russian students of Cosmism, the Cosmist approach to world problems, seeking unity, wholeness, and universality by facing and attempting to overcome a multitude of apparent contradictions, represents Beredayev's characterization of the Russian soul at its best in action. Most of the Russian Cosmists were encyclopedic geniuses who were able to work at the highest level in apparently mutually contradictory intellectual directions. Fedorov, for example, was simultaneously a futuristic visionary of unsurpassed boldness and an arch-conservative spokesman for ideas usually branded reactionary, a man with a 21st century mind and a medieval heart. Solovyov, the great philosopher who inspired Russia's Silver Age of literature and art, successor to the earlier 19th century Golden Age of Pushkin and Gogol, was a model of rational clarity, a master of lucid prose, and at the same time a mystic poet of foggy lake crossings, sociological raptures, and ardent longing for otherworldly caresses. Tsiolkovsky was a raw youth from the Russian countryside, who under Fedorov's personal direction began a course of self-education that eventually allowed him to calculate the first mathematical formulas for orbiting artificial satellites, becoming the honored grandfather of Soviet rocket science and space exploration. And at the same time, he was the author of innumerable booklets and brochures of what to many readers may seem sophomoric occult fantasies and science fiction tales. Vernadsky, an internationally honored scientist, took his original inspiration from the study of ancient Greek history and literature, was then trained in mineralogy, made significant contributions to several additional highly specialized fields of science, founded such new cross-disciplinary fields of investigation as geochemistry, biogeochemistry, and radiogeology, and most important for the purpose of our study, developed the theory of the biosphere in transition to noosphere. And Florensky, sometimes called the Russian Leonardo, was a groundbreaking mathematician, inventor, aesthetician, electrical engineer, philosopher, social worker, priest, theologian, gulag prisoner, and martyr. Best known today as author of The Pillar and the Ground of the Truth, a classic of Russian spirituality. This breadth not only of interest, then, but of competence as well, is one of the more important, quote, genetic marks of the Russian Cosmists, and is a reflection of the expansiveness and ability to contain apparent contradictions that Beredayev includes in his definition of Russianness. What then, in the last analysis, makes a cosmist a cosmist? After all, nearly all Christians believe in the transformation of the world. Marxists and romantics of all kind believe in thought as action. Utopians believe in ideal worlds. In a nutshell, what is different about the cosmists? Cosmism is a loose, diverse, and complex tendency. So rather than attempt another simple one or two sentence answer, I would prefer to look more closely first at the Russian context out of which cosmist thought emerged, then at the major individual cosmist thinkers one by one, then at what further tendencies and consequences developed from the lines of thought. And gradually, by the end of this study, we will have gained a clearer sense of what makes a cosmist, what positions the individual thinkers and the tendencies share, and on what positions they differ, and what followed or failed to follow the ideas they proposed. Thus concludes Chapter 1, The Spiritual Geography of Russian Cosmism. In 11.1, The Russian Cosmists, The Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers, by George M. Young. Next time we will continue with Section 11.2 and Chapter 2, Forerunners of Russian Cosmism. I will see you then. Olam.